Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at another aspect of 1950s American culture, and that is the Cold War and the Red Scare. Here are your video goals. So as we've already talked about, after World War II, a new conflict quickly arose. And the conflict was between the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. And the first place where this conflict played out was in Europe, which was invaded both by the United States and by the Soviet Union in World War II. The first place where conflict was really quite apparent was in Germany, as we already talked about, and Germany was actually divided up into two separate countries. A larger West Germany, which was capitalist and democratic, and a smaller East Germany that was communist and run by a Soviet-allied dictatorship. And this split between Germany and in Germany is similar to the split that happens in Europe in general. And this split is sometimes described as the Iron Curtain dividing Europe. And so the Iron Curtain is the line that separates the capitalist democracies in the West and the communist dictatorships in the East. So there's a divide between Western and Eastern Europe, and along this divide there are a bunch of military units. Both sides are pretty much ready to go to war at any moment. And a lot of people are worried that this is going to lead to another world war, this time between the United States and the Soviet Union. At home, the United States was very worried about communism, almost irrationally afraid of communism. And this time period is known as the Red Scare, which is basically the fear of communists, like secret communist organizations in the United States, working to overthrow the US government. And the leader of the Red Scare was a dude, Republican senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. And McCarthy became very famous in the early 50s for claiming to have a secret list of hidden communists in the United States. And he argued that these communists had risen to high levels of authority and were secretly working to destroy the United States. And he used this fear that people had of communism to go after his own political enemies and to build up his public image. And for a couple of years, Joseph McCarthy was one of the most powerful people in the country, because if you went against him, he could just accuse you of being a communist, and that could ruin your career. Anyway, this fear of communism goes beyond just Joseph McCarthy, and at the highest levels of government, you were at risk of being targeted by the government if they thought you were a communist. So if you ever spoke out in favor of the Soviet Union or of communism in general, you were at risk of losing your job and ruining your entire career. So this is pretty clearly a crackdown on free speech, and it was done because of unconfirmed fears about communist plots. There's no evidence that there was any real serious threat of a communist revolt in the United States, but nonetheless, thousands of people were targeted by the government, and lives were ruined because of communist fears. On the larger scale, there really were some problems as for the United States as communism begins to spread. The United States had already adopted, after the end of the Second World War, an international strategy called containment. And the idea was that the United States was going to work hard to prevent the spread of communism to any new countries. But this turns out to be very, very difficult. And very soon after the idea of containment comes around, the world's most populous country, China, becomes a communist nation. And so now almost all of Asia is communist. And people worry that communism is going to continue to spread. And the main reason that people are so worried about the spread of communism is this mistaken idea that all communist nations are on the same team. this is called the myth of monolithic communism. Monolithic just means it's one big chunk of something. And so the United States thinks that any country that is communist is automatically going to be allied with the Soviet Union. And this is not true. It'd be kind of like today just assuming that all capitalist countries are on the same team, which is obviously not true. The United States and Russia are both communist countries today, but we still conflict with each other. So anyway, because the United States thinks that the communist countries are all on the same team, we view expansion and the spread of communism as a serious threat. And this leads us to fight any communist regime anywhere in the world that we think we can stop. One thing that happens is, as a result of fears of communism and communist aggression, the United States leads the formation of a very powerful military alliance that is called NATO. NATO is short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it includes the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and Greece and Turkey. And the idea here was that these different countries would work together to provide collective security for all members of the organization. And what this means is that if any country is attacked by any other country, all the countries within NATO will respond as if they themselves had been attacked. So that what that means is that if the Soviet Union decided to invade, let's say, Italy, every country in NATO would respond and fight back against Russia. And so this was designed to prevent any Russian attacks, because Russia knew that if it messed with one NATO member, it would, in effect, be messing with all NATO members. In response, the Soviet Union forms its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact, and it's basically a Soviet version of NATO, where the USSR and its Eastern European allies form into a similar sort of defensive alliance. And the significance here is that this makes any conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, it means that it's going to drag most of the other rich nations of the world into conflict. And this could start World War III. However, this also leads to deterrence. Because the cost of starting a war would be so high, it'd be a world war, it's going to make both sides avoid starting a war as much as possible. And that's the idea of deterrence, is that you make the cost of doing something so high that somebody chooses not to do it. Another thing that happens in the early 1950s as a result of the US thinking about communism is the Korean War. This is the first major war fought after World War II. It happens in 1950, just 5 years after the end of World War II. And Korea, after the end of World War II, was divided between the United States and Russia, much like Germany was. And what happens here is you get two separate countries. In the north, you get a communist dictatorship, North Korea, ruled by Kim Il-sung. And in the south, you get a capitalist country ruled by a supposedly democratic strongman, really kind of just a dictator also, named Syngman Rhee. And what we see here is a proxy war. And it's the first of many proxy wars in the Cold War. And a proxy war is when two stronger countries compete with each other by supporting smaller allies. And this is going to happen in Korea. So in 1950, North Korea decides to invade South Korea in order to try and take back the entire peninsula. The United States wants to keep its capitalist ally around and wants to stop the spread of communism because of its idea of containment and all that. And so the United States goes and helps South Korea by sending in a whole bunch of troops to protect it. And the United States is successful and begins to push back the North Korean army. And just when it seems like the war is about to end, China actually joins, communist China joins the war to help North Korea. Also, the Soviet Union supports North Korea, like providing fighter jets and stuff like that to help North Korea stay in the war. but never formally enters the war. So this is the Soviet Union supporting one of its allies without actually joining the war. And so after 3 years of fighting, the war ends in 1953 in a stalemate. It's just a tie. The peninsula remains divided, and this is the first war that the United States fights to stop the spread of communism, but it's not going to be the last. As the Korean War is winding down, the United States needs to elect a new president. President Truman has served for 2 terms, and it's now time for somebody else to run. And the winner of this election is the Republican Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was the commander of Allied forces in World War II. He was the leading general in Europe during the war. And one of Dwight Eisenhower's main strategies during the election is he accuses Truman and the Democrats of being soft on communism, which is really pretty ridiculous because, as you already know, the Truman Doctrine was a very strong stance taken against the Soviet Union to stand up to them militarily and protect U.S. allies. But nevertheless, this accusation by Dwight Eisenhower succeeds, and Dwight, that is President Eisenhower, wins the election. And he goes on to take an even more hardline stance against the USSR. He's really going to show Russia who is boss. And one of the developments that begins with Eisenhower's presidency is the beginning of the nuclear arms race, which could potentially still, even today, lead to the end of the world. So an arms race is when 2 countries or several countries compete to develop better and better weapons. So if you build a bomb, I'll build a bigger bomb, and then you'll build an even bigger bomb until we both just have a whole bunch of really big bombs. And that's exactly what happens. So the first technology developed during the arms race is the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb is a type of atomic bomb that is 1,000 times more powerful than the original atomic bombs. And this is a weapon of incredible destructiveness. It can leave a huge crater in the earth. The power released by one of these bombs is incredible. It can just wipe a city off the map, kill millions of people. And this bomb was developed in 1952 and tested by the United States. And there's a picture there of the first hydrogen bomb test where it essentially just blew up an entire island. A year later, the Soviet Union also develops a hydrogen bomb. So now both the United States and the Soviet Union have these incredibly powerful weapons that can destroy cities. On top of that, what makes it even scarier is there's another weapon developed called an intercontinental ballistic missile, called I.C.B.M.S for short. And these missiles are weapons that can be fired basically around the world. You can shoot a missile from Nebraska and have it land in Russia. And moreover, these missiles can be tipped with hydrogen bombs. And so what this means is that you can now shoot the world's most destructive weapon ever developed anywhere in the world very, very quickly. These missiles go up, they basically go into outer space and then crash down super fast, faster than the speed of sound at the place that they are targeting. And so this is essentially just instant death from above. The USSR develops theirs in 1957, and the USA develops its in 1958. And because they both now have these missiles and these bombs, you get a situation called mutually assured destruction, called MAD for short. And basically what happens is each side builds up such a huge supply of nukes and missiles that if anybody attacked one side, the other side would be destroyed. And this is basically an extreme form of deterrence, because if anybody starts the war, both sides die. And over the next couple decades, this leads to tens of thousands of hydrogen bombs and missiles being created. And as you can see in that graph there, by 1960, the United States had created almost 30,000 nuclear warheads, which is enough not just to destroy Russia, but to potentially destroy the world. And this makes the 1950s an age of anxiety. even though people were living wealthier lives than ever before, many millions of people in the United States lived in beautiful houses and had just started families, they were also terrified. Americans were terrified both of the irrational threat of communism, communist plots, but also terrified of the really very, very possible risk of nuclear war, where thousands of hydrogen bombs would explode and basically end life on the planet. And so this makes the 1950s age where a lot of people are very worried. And one of the weird manifestations of this is that you actually see bomb shelters start to get built all over the 1950s. There's a picture there. I think that's an advertisement for a bomb shelter that a family of 4 could live in. So anyway, that's kind of the outcome of the beginning of the Cold War in the 1950s. And we're going to look at how this develops over the course of the 60s and 70s in later videos.